Hi everyone and welcome to our module on the arterial supply to the upper limb. In this module, we're talking about the major arteries that gives blood supply to the upper limb. We talk about everything there is to note about the axillary artery, the brachial artery, the radial artery, and the ulnar artery. So the arterial supply to the entire upper limb is derived from four major vessels. These vessels tend to supply different aspects of the upper limb. The axillary artery, for example, will supply the entire axilla and the shoulder and pectoral region. The brachial artery supplies the arm. The radial and ulnar artery will supply the forearm as well as the hand.
So this image captures for us the entire arterial supply to the upper limb alongside the source. The source in this case be the left ventricle. Left ventricle will pump blood into the arc of aorta. The arc of aorta give rise to three major branches: the brachiocephalic trunk on the right side, and then the left common carotid and the left subclavian on the left side. The right brachiocephalic would eventually become right subclavian and right common carotid. Our major focus is on the subclavian because the right and left subclavian would eventually become the axilla or the axillary artery. And it is from here that we tend to start talking about the blood supply to the upper limb. From the right and left axillary artery, these arteries would become the brachial artery as they run into the arm, and then from the right and left brachial artery, the arm, once they enter into the forearm, they would split into right and left radial and ulnar arteries, as you can see. Then finally, the right and left radial and ulnar arteries now eventually form what we call digital arteries that would supply the fingers and the hand. So we'll talk about each of these arteries one by one. We start with the right and left axillary artery, then we move to the brachial artery, then we'll talk about the radial and the ulnar arteries. Starting with the axillary artery is regarded as the main artery to the upper limb. And in terms of what we need to note about the axillary artery, we need to note its origin, where it starts from, its course, how it runs, and then its termination, how it ends. The axillary artery tends to commence as a continuation of the subclavian artery. It starts at the lateral border of the first rib. So the lateral border of the first rib tends to separate the subclavian artery from the axillary artery. Before you get to the lateral border, the artery there is called subclavian. Beyond the lateral border of the first rib, we refer to the artery as the axillary artery, and that's the origin of the axillary artery. Once it originates from that point, it travels within the axilla laterally, and very importantly, while it is present within the axillary artery tends to be crossed by a muscle. And the relationship between the axillary artery and this muscle is regarded as a posterior relationship. So we say that the axillary artery tends to pass posterior to the pectoralis minor muscle. This is a very key point to remember, especially when we start talking about the branches of the axillary artery. The axillary artery would descend towards the teres major, and at the inferior border of the teres major, it enters into the arm. So therefore, beyond the inferior border of the teres major, we stop calling the artery the axillary artery and start to call this same artery the brachial artery. This is an image of the axillary artery. You can see how it starts from the lateral border of the first rib in this image, and then it descends within the axilla. While it is present within the axilla, it is crossed by the pectoralis minor muscle. You can see how the axillary artery passes behind pectoralis minor. And then finally, it runs all the way down towards the teres major muscle. At the inferior border of the teres major muscle, as you can see here, the axillary artery will terminate, becoming the brachial artery. The three major parts of the axillary artery, this is known as the three divisions of the axillary artery. The first part of the axillary artery is the part that tends to start from the lateral border of the first rib and ends at the medial border of the pectoralis minor, just before the axillary artery runs behind the pectoralis minor. The second part of the axillary artery is the part that is found directly behind the pectoralis minor. And then the third part of the axillary artery is the part that tends to emerge from the pectoralis minor. So it runs from the lateral border of the pectoralis minor and ends at the inferior border of the teres major, where it terminates. So this is an image showing us the three major parts of the axillary artery again. The first part starting from the lateral border of the first rib and ending at the medial border of the pectoralis minor muscle. So this is the first part here. The second part is the part that is found directly behind the pectoralis minor. This is the entire second part of the axillary artery here painted in black. And then finally, the third part of the axillary artery is the part that tends to emerge from the pectoralis minor. So it's found at the lateral border of the pectoralis minor and runs all the way to the inferior border of the teres major. And that's where it ends. So this is the third part. Now, the branches of the axillary artery tend to follow the part of the axillary artery that we've talked about in the previous slide. Remember, we have three major parts or three major divisions of the axillary artery. As a result, we have um, branches coming from each of these divisions. The first part of the axillary artery will give rise to just a single branch. This branch is called the superior thoracic artery. This artery is a small artery that arises from the first part. It tends to be involved in supplying the first and second intercostal spaces alongside supplying the serratus anterior muscle. The second part of the axillary artery, the part behind the pectoralis minor muscle, gives rise to two major branches. These branches include thoracoacromial artery and the lateral thoracic artery. And what you need to note about the thoracoacromial artery is that it's a short wide trunk that tend to pierce through a particular membrane called the costocoracoid membrane. This artery tends to divide further into four branches. So thoracoacromial gives rise to four branches: the acromial artery, the deltoid artery, the pectoral artery, and the clavicular artery. These are all sub branches of the thoracoacromial artery. Then the second artery that arises from the second part of the axillary artery is the lateral thoracic artery. This is variable in its origin, but what we need to remember about the lateral thoracic artery is that it descends along the lateral border of the pectoralis minor, hence the name. And sometimes it may arise from the thoracoacromial, it may arise from other sources like the suprascapular artery and the subscapular arteries. So it's not every single cases that in every single case that we see the lateral thoracic artery originates from the second part of the axillary artery. What it tends to supply the pectoral muscles. It also supplies axillary nodes and the breast. The third part of the axillary artery tends to have three major branches that emerges from it. This includes the subscapular artery, the anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries, and each of these arteries are going to be supplying different aspects of the axilla. Starting with the subscapular artery. Subscapular artery is the largest branch of the axillary artery. That is very key to note. So amongst all arteries, all branches of the axillary artery, subscapular seems to be the largest. Um, Subscapular artery also tend to divide further into two branches. These branches are the circumflex scapular artery and the thoracodorsal artery. And these arteries, they tend to wrap around the scapula to form what we call the scapular anastomosis. The subscapular artery alongside its two branches will supply structures like the subscapularis muscle, the latissimus dorsi muscle, teres major muscle, and the serratus anterior muscle. And finally, we have the anterior circumflex humeral artery and the posterior circumflex humeral artery, which are the last two branches of the third part of the axillary artery. The anterior circumflex humeral artery is the smaller one when you compare it to the posterior circumflex humeral artery, and it tends to pass laterally deep to the coracobrachialis muscle and the biceps brachii muscle, and is involved in giving ascending branch to the shoulder to supply the shoulder joint. The posterior circumflex artery, on the other hand, is larger compared to the anterior circumflex artery. It passes medially through the posterior wall of the axilla and tends to be involved in supplying shoulder joint alongside the anterior circumflex humeral artery. So these two arteries are typically involved in supplying the glenohumeral joint or the shoulder joint. So this is the image showing us some of the branches of the axillary artery that we talked already about. You see that from the first part of the axillary artery, that's the part that starts from the lateral border of the first rib and ends at the medial border of the pectoralis minor. We have just one branch originating from that particular portion, and that's the superior thoracic artery. And when we move to the second part of the axillary artery, the part directly behind the pectoralis minor muscle, we have two arteries originating. Each of these two arteries tend to emerge from the sides of the artery. You can see thoracoacromial artery here originated from the medial aspect of the pectoralis minor muscle, and this artery further divides into four arteries as we talked about. And then Still on the second part of the axillary artery, we can see the lateral thoracic artery originating from the lateral part of the pectoralis minor and then descending towards the pectoral muscle. So this is the second branch of the second part of the axillary artery. For the third part of the axillary artery, the part that tends to begin from the lateral border of the pectoralis minor and end at the inferior border of the teres major muscle. This particular portion of the axillary artery has three branches coming off of it. The first is the subscapular artery, and that is the largest branch of the entire axillary artery, as you can see. Remember that the subscapular artery will further divide into circumflex scapular artery and thoracodorsal artery. And then the remaining two branches of the third part of the axillary artery are the anterior and posterior circumflex humeral artery. What is key to remember about this artery is the fact that both of them tend to emerge and then they tend to wrap around the surgical neck of the humerus, as you can see here. And it's from this point that they would give blood supply to the shoulder joint. The brachial artery is second on our list. It's the arterial supply to the entire arm. The brachial artery tends to be a continuation of the axillary artery, right from where the axillary artery terminates. At that point, we have the brachial artery being formed from. So, brachial artery is said to originate at the inferior border of the teres major as a direct continuation of the axillary artery. Once the brachial artery arises at the inferior border of the teres major, it descends down the arm, and we tend to say it's found at the medial part of the arm. Brachial artery is superficial and palpable throughout its course, so you can feel it. And in terms of its location, though it's found superficially, you say it lies anterior to the triceps and brachialis muscles. At the upper part of the arm, it is found medial to the humerus, but lower down, it's found anterior to the humerus. One more thing you need to know about the brachial artery is the fact that it is accompanied by the median nerve as it descends towards the cubital fossa, and then the median nerve tends to cross it at the distal part of the arm. Once the brachial artery gets to the cubital fossa, it terminates by dividing into two smaller arteries. These arteries are the radial artery and the ulnar artery. Termination of the brachial artery at the cubital fossa is said to be opposite the neck of the radius and under cover of the bicipital aponeurosis. There are four major branches that emerges from the brachial artery, and these arteries will be supplying different aspects of the arm. These arteries include the profunda or brachial artery, also called the deep brachial artery. This artery will be supplying a lot of muscles present within the arm, including the biceps muscle, the triceps muscle, the brachialis muscle, and coracobrachialis. Alongside that, we have the superior ulnar collateral artery and the inferior ulnar collateral artery. These arteries will be giving extra blood supply to the ulnar artery. And then finally, we have the nutrient artery of the brachial artery that supply the bone of the arm, which is the humerus. This is a picture of the brachial artery. You can see the different branches of the brachial artery, starting with the deep brachial artery. One very key thing to remember about the deep brachial artery is that once it originates from the brachial artery, it runs in the posterior part of the arm, and it tends to be accompanied with the radial nerve as it descends the arm, because the brachial artery and the radial nerve passes or lodges on a particular landmark at the back of the shaft of the humerus, and that landmark is called the radial groove. Other branches that you could see are the ulnar collateral artery. You can see the superior ulnar collateral artery here and the inferior ulnar collateral artery here. And then finally, we have the nutrient artery, which is not necessarily shown in this image. With regards to the arterial supply of the forearm, the radial artery alongside the ulnar artery are the two major arteries supplying that portion of the upper limb. The radial artery is a smaller one compared to the ulnar. Either of them tend to originate from the brachial artery at the cubital fossa. Remember that at the cubital fossa, close to the neck of the radius, we have the brachial artery bifurcating into the radial artery and the ulnar artery. Hence, the radial artery has its point of origin at this particular site. From the point of origin of the radial artery, it travels downwards in the lateral part of the forearm. As it runs down the forearm, we say that the radial artery lies on the muscles of the forearm until it reaches the distal part. At the distal part, it tends to lie on the anterior surface of the radius and it's covered by skin and fascia. Because of this, because of how it tends to be related to the muscles found on top of the muscles at the proximal part of the forearm, and then found on top of the bone and covered by skin and fascia at the distal part of the forearm. We say that the pulsation of the radial artery is felt throughout the entire arm. That's very important to know. While the radial artery runs down the forearm, it is accompanied by the radial nerve. We say that the course of the radial artery in the forearm is represented by joining the midpoint of the cubital fossa to the point just medial to the radial styloid process. So it's not really a straight line per se, but more of a line running from the cubital fossa and obliquely towards the styloid process. The radial artery tends to leave the forearm by winding around the lateral aspect of the wrist. So it tends to curve dorsally around the scaphoid bone and the trapezium of the wrist and the palm, and it passes through a particular space called the anatomical snuff box to enter into the palm. So we say that it tends to pass between the heads of the first dorsal interosseous muscle and then turns medially and passes between the heads of the adductor pollicis before eventually entering into the palm. So once the radial artery makes its exit from the forearm by winding around the wrist to enter into the palm, at the palm, the radial artery terminates by becoming the deep palmar arc. What are the branches of the radial artery? The radial artery has numerous branches, including the radial recurrent artery, the muscular branch of the radial artery, the palmar carpal branch of the radial artery, the dorsal carpal branch of the radial artery, and then the superficial palmar branches of the superficial palmar arc. All these are branches of the radial artery. Now in this image, we can see the radial artery in a nutshell. You can see the entire course of the radial artery, starting from where it originates from at the cubital fossa. At the cubital fossa, we see the brachial artery divided into a lateral radial branch and a medial ulnar branch. And what we see that is that we can see the radial artery descending through the forearm on the lateral part of the forearm. The proximal part of the forearm is found directly on top of muscles. You can see some of the muscles where the radial artery would sit on. So muscles like the brachioradialis are muscles that are found underneath the radial artery. One thing you should also notice is the fact that the radial nerve is accompanying the radial artery as it descends towards the wrist. And once it gets to the wrist, the radial artery would now wind around the wrist to enter into the palm through the anatomical snuff box before it becomes the deep palmar artery. The second artery giving supply to the forearm is the ulnar artery. Compared to the radial artery, the ulnar artery is larger and similar to what we have in the radial artery. It originates at the neck of the radius in the cubital fossa from the bifurcation of the brachial artery. From the point of origin of the ulnar artery, it travels down the medial part of the forearm. So this is contrast to what we see for the radial artery, which travels down the lateral part of the forearm. The pulsation of the ulnar artery, unlike the radial artery, is felt only at the lateral side of the flexor carpi ulnaris tendon, where it lies anterior to the ulnar head. So it's not really felt throughout the entire course of the artery. And similarly to what we have in the radial artery, the ulnar artery is also accompanied by a nerve. In this case, it's accompanied by the ulnar nerve. And then finally, the ulnar artery, for it to terminate into the wrist, tends to pass through what we call the Gugnion's canal. The termination of the ulnar artery in the palm is by its formation of an arc called the superficial palmar arc. Now, this is contrast to what we see in the radial artery that gives rise to what we call the deep palmar arc. So we can say that both of the arteries of the forearm would give rise to arteries within the hand. For the radial artery, it gives rise to the deep palmar arc. For the ulnar artery, it gives rise to the superficial palmar arc. What are the branches of the ulnar artery? We have more branches of the ulnar artery compared to the radial artery. This includes the anterior ulnar recurrent artery, posterior ulnar recurrent artery, common interosseous artery, anterior interosseous artery, posterior interosseous artery. So we have a lot of interosseous and recurrent arteries found at the proximal part of the forearm. We have the muscular branches of the ulnar artery that will supply a lot of muscles within the forearm. We have the palmar carpal branch of the ulnar artery within the hand, the dorsal carpal branch of the ulnar artery also within the hand, then the superficial branch of the ulnar artery, and then the deep palmar branch to the deep palmar arc. All these are branches of the ulnar artery, supplying structures within the forearm alongside the hand. Here's a picture of our ulnar artery and brachial artery alongside the radial artery one more time. You can see the brachial artery bifurcating at the cubital fossa into a radial artery and an ulnar artery. The radial artery will run laterally on the forearm. The ulnar artery runs medially in the forearm. And you see how the ulnar artery tends to run towards the the wrist. At the wrist, it tends to penetrate through a particular space or canal called the Goyon's canal to make its way into the hand, into the palms. At the palms, the ulnar artery becomes what we call the superficial palmar arc. That's not really shown in this image because in this image we could only see the deep palmar arc, and that is given rise to by the radial artery. So this is an image of some of the branches that we talked about regarding the ulnar artery. You can see the common interosseous artery, the posterior interosseous artery, and then anterior interosseous artery being um, emerging from the ulnar artery in this particular image. We can also see some of the other arteries like the brachial artery and radial artery, but more importantly, we see ulnar nerve being the nerve that accompanies the ulnar artery. So in this image, we can see the blood supply to the hand and the digits. The blood supply to the hand and the digits comes from two major palmar arches, superficial palmar arc and the deep palmar arc. From the previous slide, when we talked about the arterial supply to the forearm, we talked about how the radial artery and the ulnar artery tends to terminate. If you remember, the ulnar artery terminates by becoming superficial palmar arc, whereas the radial artery terminates by becoming the deep palmar arc. So from these two arches, the superficial palmar arc and the deep palmar arc, we have digital arteries emerging and supplying the fingers. So for example, we have the princeps pollicis artery supplying the thumb, we have the radial artery of the index finger supplying the index finger, and we have the proper palmar digital artery and the common palmar digital artery supplying the rest of the fingers. And this, in a nutshell, just captures the blood supply to the hand. And that's why we tend to say that the radial artery and the ulnar artery would eventually give blood supply to the hand. One thing to remember is that though the radial artery gives rise to the deep palmar arc and the ulnar artery gives rise to the superficial palmar arc, each of these arteries have smaller blood supply or branches coming from separate or opposite arteries. So, for example, superficial palmar arc would have a bit of branch being given off by the radial artery to give rise to it. Same thing with the deep palmar arc. The palmar arc would have a bit of branch coming from the ulnar artery to give rise to it. And this completes the entire arc because the arc would start from one end and then will be completed by the artery on the other end. Although, albeit a small branch being produced from that other end. What are the clinical significance of the arterial supply to the upper limb? Alright, this includes scapular anastomosis, which we'll talk about very soon. Volkmann's ischemic contracture, which is a pathology due to damage of one of the arteries we mentioned when talking about the brachial artery. The radial pulse, which is a clinically applicable artery, what we tend to use when examining the pulse rate. And then finally, the arterial blood pressure, which is measured usually at the cubital fossa where the brachial artery tends to bifurcate. Starting with this is an image of a person with Volkmann's ischemic contracture. So this is a condition that occurs when there is a damage to the deep brachial artery or the profunda brachial artery, which is a branch of the brachial artery at the arm. So once it's damaged to that artery, blood supply to the rest of the forearm all the way down would be affected, and as a result, they would have a contracture of um, the muscles of the forearm, and as a result, this would give rise to this deformity shown in the image above. Here's a live image of Volkmann's ischemic contracture. Remember that it's a condition that occurs when there's a damage to the deep brachial artery or the profunda brachial artery, which is the branch of the brachial artery at the arm. One of the commonest ways where the brachial artery could be damaged is in a fracture to the mid shaft. Remember that the mid shaft fracture could affect the radial nerve because of its passage at the radial groove. Also, remember that the deep brachial artery passes through that radial groove. So once there's a mid shaft fracture, it can damage with the radial nerve, leading to a wrist drop, and also damage the deep brachial artery, leading to Volkmann's ischemic contracture. So this image depicts for us scapular anastomosis. Scapular anastomosis involves the communication of multiple arteries from different sources and is there to actually provide collateral supply in case there is a situation where one of the major arteries is affected. In the case of this image, we have the axillary artery, particularly the third part of the axillary artery being involved in this scapular anastomosis. Remember that the third part of the axillary artery gives rise to subscapular artery, as you can see down below. Then the subscapular artery would further divide into the circumflex scapular artery and the thoracodorsal artery. This is the circumflex scapular artery, and then this is the thoracodorsal artery. Both of these branches of the subscapular artery will be involved in the formation of the scapular anastomosis. And the arteries that they tend to understand the most are arteries coming from the subclavian artery. So we can say that branches from the subclavian artery would anastomose branches of the axillary artery to form what they call the scapular anastomosis. Just to be clear, the subclavian artery, the part of the subclavian artery giving rise to the scapular anastomosis is the thyrocervical trunk. So thyrocervical trunk will give rise to arteries like the suprascapular artery and the D branch of the transverse cervical artery. From these two arteries, we have the communication between these two arteries and the subscapular artery and its branches. And as a result, anastomotic network is formed from the union of the following arteries. The image below is showing us how normal blood pressure reading is taken. We tend to make use of the brachial artery in taking our blood pressure reading. What we tend to do is we apply the cuff around the brachial artery to compress it, and then we tend to listen to what we call crack cuff sounds. These are sounds that would tell us about the pressure of the heart at the brachial artery, usually systolic pressure and diastolic pressure. And this is a very technical skill to master, and it's something you would eventually learn when you get to a clinical class. You might eventually learn it or initially learn it during your physiology class, but you'll perfect it when you get to clinical class where you understand the basis behind each of this. But key thing to note is that when checking the blood pressure, we tend to make use of the cubital fossa because that is one of the areas where the brachial artery tends to be found or tends to be palpated. And in fact, that's the area where it tends to bifurcate. We use the cubital fossa as a site when we listen to the systolic and diastolic pressures of the blood vessels. And the final image here shows for us the radial artery and its use in the case of pulse rates. So one of the ways in which we can feel the radial pulse is by checking for the radial artery just medial to the styloid process of the hand. So checking at the styloid process will help us in palpating the radial artery. From here, we can calculate a number of things. We can calculate the rate of the pulse of the radial artery. We can calculate the volume of blood flowing through the radial artery. We can calculate things as delicate as the arterial thickness. But typically, what we tend to use is this particular site for checking for the pulse rate, which is usually between 60 to 100 beats per minute. And that concludes our module on the arterial supply to the upper limb.